Aidan, hello, he, him, I consent.
Elena, Diallo, she, her, I also consent.
Cool, closing off.
Speaking first, Ryan, he, him, best of luck all, and I consent.
Hi all, Tejas speaking second. Here they works. Good luck for the ban, and I'm also good with being streamed.
Swag, and closing off.
Then speaking first, here they please, I consent.
Paula second, she, her, consent.
Perfect. So by my count, that has everyone consenting. So standing orders are as follows. Speeches are 7 minutes in length, the first and last minute being protected time between which you can and should offer points of information as they constitute an important part of engagement. Would one of my wings be able to do the timestamps in the chat? Cool. Okay, perfect. With that being said, without further ado, on the motion that this House believes that social media companies should manipulate users' news feeds in order to promote progressive content, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open the case that stands in their name. Here.
Multiple, right?
Perfectly.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. In a world in which every single day you are expressed to opinions, to hit pieces, to news, to conversations with friends and relatives that influence you in any way imaginable, we think it's justified to weaponize the minds of people to achieve societal means, considering that every single individual is an equal moral actor. Thus, we think it's the best world is one in which we maximize the total people. Progressivism is the ideology that receives that. Firstly, framing this debate, what we are talking about, and secondly, why we achieve more progressivism and why this is an inherent good that exists within the status quo. First, on how this will be done, likely done in a gradual way, that is to say, not completely shifting the algorithm to be excessively progressive at once, but likely gradually shifting towards more progressivism and still retaining some right-wing content for the sake of having a contrast between political views. Secondly, they are likely to do it at a maximum discrepancy and secrecy, considering that in the vast majority of cases, you wish to avoid public backlash. The most obvious response is they're going to be whistleblowers, they're going to reveal something. This is completely symmetrical on both sides, because currently we live in a highly politically polarized and culturally warfare environment in which a right-wing demagogue have a pragmatic incentive to make conspiracy theories that existing social medias are currently liberally dominant. Just think about Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Elon Musk who bought Twitter. All they say is the status quo is dominantly liberal leaning, so we're not certain why any social political backlash is going to be asymmetrical relative to the highly subjective status quo right now. The second point of framing is what are we obviously talking about. Progressivism has 4 main tenets that I'm going to explain, and I'm going to prove why this is the likely interpretation that is going to exist. The first is a recognition of positive rights. That is to say, we tax the rich and redistribute to the poor because we realize that you cannot exercise your agency if you don't have sufficient resources to choose your own career, to have free time, to not experience burnout, to have a basic amount of physical comfort. We tax the rich to have universal healthcare because we realize that your right to life is bullshit if you don't have the right to be treated physically and mentally to access that particular right. This is the first core tenet. The second one is always seeking to improve society and to get progress, which is in total opposition to right-wing political viewpoints that are more traditionalist, either returning to the previous status quo or preserving the status quo or being excessively slow in progressing and being very risk-averse in that particular way, which is necessary because the world is facing problems that we haven't faced before. Climate change requires a fundamental shift in our economical and current societal structures because we're very close to the tipping point in which there is no reversibility and we're all going to die. Like we're very close to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in the temperatures, which is why we must have a massive shift that is not slow and that doesn't focus on the status quo. The third likely interpretation is focus on minority rights. Those could be ethnical minorities that were historically oppressed or LGBTQ+ people that were generally oppressed by society by currently existing socially conservative, religious, and generally speaking traditional norms. And the fourth thing that is common with progressivism is a maximization of liberty. This is why we support a separation of states. This is why we support more abortion for women because they can best decide the circumstances upon which they're operating, unless it is absolutely necessary. For example, taking away some of the freedom of rich people or gun shooters, if we are aiming on the caution of giving maximum freedom to people. This is likely to be the broad interpretation for 2 reasons. The first reason is simply speaking, this is the interpretation that most political and social movements have. It's more broad and general and not excessively radical to attract the biggest amount of people. But secondly, social medias would not wish to be suddenly become communists and to be labeled as communists, which is why they would go for a more broadly accepted particular thing of progressivism. Now, onto the argument. Why do we want to make more people progressive, and how are we going to achieve this? I would posit two mechanisms as to why we're better able to achieve it. The first mechanism is internalization through continuous repetition. I want to ask you something, panel. What 2 plus 2? How much is 2 plus 2? 4, right? You intuitively say it. Why? Because you have heard it a million times. You don't even think otherwise. It's an internal part of you. The more you hear a concept without it being disputed, especially at times in which you are not thinking clearly, you're mentally exhausted, you are emotionally drained, you're just brainless scrolling, the more you take it as a given, the more familiar it becomes, which is why we are likely to succeed in massively shifting society. Because the average person uses social media every single fucking day. Statistically speaking, the average person uses it for 7 hours. Like, I can bet half of my judges that are judging me are browsing on social media while judging to me as well. It's either A, highly addictive. It gives you short-term gratification through the form of dopamine, or B, in many cases you are coerced to use it because this is dominant social norm in many particular cases, or 3, in many cases you can rationalize, oh, I'm just social networking in LinkedIn, or I'm just researching for debates, I'm not wasting my time on YouTube. So it's very easy for you to get instant gratification, which your brain craves. The average person massively uses it through repetition. They're going to get brainwashed, and that's a good thing. The second mechanism is gradual shifts in algorithms. And here I want to illustrate how this is likely to be done. Imagine you are a dissatisfied Rust Belt worker in America. We're not going to say suddenly become a communist. We're going to recommend you a video in which you are saying, isn't it very convenient that all your industries went to the developing world because of corporations that want to maximize their profits? We don't have to suddenly start with you being a communist. We can do it gradually. For example, we will first recommend you a liberal channel, then a left-leaning liberal channel. We'll first start with like a Destiny, then we can go for Vosh, then we can go for Hakim. We can do it gradually, and this is likely to be more effective because people don't change their beliefs at once, especially if they are long-term beliefs in that particular way, which is why this is likely to be done gradually. The sheer amount of usage and how you brainlessly scroll social media is likely to influence beliefs to a massive degree. Before I continue, closing.
Given your interpretation of progressivism, which you would promote, why do you inherently think that the right of a rich person to their individually earned property is morally more important than the right of a poor person to redistribute wealth?
First, their right is non-existent. It's morally arbitrary for them to get rich, to have the willpower, to have the nepotism, to have the resources. It's morally arbitrary your position in society, your soft skills, your brain power, the environment in which you are born in, the social connections that you have. If everything is morally arbitrary, we would rather distribute it in a way in which we meet the basic material needs of the average person. This is the first intuitive response. Secondly, we're fine with trading off moral transgressions towards one particular group if we're improving the freedom of other groups. That is to say, intuitively we'll take 1 million from a billionaire if we could save 1,000 starving children, right? Because sure, it's a minor transgression of ordinary rights, but it massively improves the right to life of other people and their own stake in life. Why is this the most important thing within the round? Firstly, own intensity. Progressivism inherently cares about the most vulnerable people within society. And secondly, it is better able to counterbalance for existing tendencies for people to be right-leaning. That is to say, the romanticization of nostalgia. That is to say, the status quo bias of people in which they wish to preserve existing structures. That is to say, our inherent desire to be sexist, racist, tribalistic, which is something that galvanizes people, and in the absence of this dominant brainwashing, is likely to hurt them right-wing and to hurt other people. On all those grounds, propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the very fine speech and call upon the leader of opposition to open the case for the opposition side. Hear.
Cool. Can I be heard?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. 3, 2, 1. First, a piece of rebuttal and then 2 arguments. The first piece of rebuttal is just, I think it's a weird quirk of this motion that government has to prove that progressivism is in and of itself a good thing. And I think they realize that and then spend like 4 minutes doing it, but I don't think they do a very good job. They say a few things. Firstly, they say people have a right to liberty, whatever the fuck that means, which seems to be a very good argument for protecting private property or the shrinking of the state rather than the enlargement of the state. The second thing they say is that conservatism is bad, but it's unclear why it is morally unjustifiable to, for example, have subscribe to Christianity and have those kinds of beliefs and things like that. Thirdly, they say taxes and redistribution are good, but private property, many people argue, is justly gained. And so it is immoral to take that away from people. Or, for example, more pragmatically, if you want to talk about utilitarian benefits, protecting private property is very good at producing incentives to participate in the economy. Or, for example, left-wing economics is inflationary and doesn't work, or private services are more efficient and it's better to prune the government. Look, I don't personally believe any of those things, but a hell of a lot of people do. And if you want to justify a priori progressivism, you better spend more than 3 minutes doing it. That makes government very hard in this debate, but that's not my fault. Two arguments then. Firstly, on why this produces backlash, and secondly, on the principle. Actually, I'll start with the principle. Firstly, on why this is immoral. Look, OG sets this debate up by saying, because they realize the backlash argument is coming, and they're like, I'm going to make it as secret as possible. Look, let's assume that this actually works. This is 100% secret. No one will ever find out about this. Why is that principally bad? Because, no, social media companies are like any other company. You exchange, like, they make profits, and then you get a service in return, right? Like, that is what you have consented to when you decide to, like, give all of your privacy away. Like, maybe it is free to sign up to these services, but the way in which they make money is they take your data and they sell it to third parties and stuff like that. So really, indirectly, you are paying them, and then you are getting a service in return. And so if it is the case that they are not giving you the service that they promised to you, that you consented to, the one that you have agreed to specifically, that is theft. It is analogous to, for example, if you bought a VPN service and it doesn't work, it's actually leaking your data to the fucking CIA or whatever, or it's giving it to whatever organization it wants. That is theft because you have not consented to that happening. You have agreed to a service. They are making profits in return, and it is fundamentally immoral for them to lie to you and steal your data. That, I think, is theft. Note, the more you believe opening government, that is, the more you believe all of their practical benefits, the more important this principle becomes. They're inversely proportionate. That is to say, the more secret you believe this is, the more effective this is at brainwashing people, the more it is principally immoral, the more it constitutes a theft. This is principally not something that we should do. But then secondly, on pragmatics backlash, first question I want to ask is, why wouldn't they be able to hide this? Firstly, because there will be whistleblowers, right? There will be people working at these companies that find this principally immoral. Even if you might not credit it as principally immoral, there are plenty of people who do think of it as principally immoral. And note, they do not have to be right-wing dingbats for this to happen. They just have to be normal fucking people who think that brainwashing people is not a very good idea and not something that they signed up to do, which means that they're going to go to the media because this story would be absolutely eaten up, because they would be given every single primetime interview that they've had a choice to. That is in their direct incentives, right? And so they will be able to do this. So this information will go public. Why does that then lead to a disproportionate and extreme reaction? 4 reasons why. Firstly, it is because it feeds into pre-existing narratives around tech companies and the woke establishment in general. All of the stuff that OG want to talk about like, conservatives being like, oh, look, they're fucking cramming progressivism and LGBT shit down our throats. All of these tech companies are like Silicon Valley liberal snowflakes or whatever, right? All of that stuff. But no, it's not just right-wing people. It's also just normies and even left-wing people who care about things like data, who care about things like privacy, or, for example, people who just don't want this stuff being crammed down their throats. OG has a stab at this and says, oh, it's symmetric because, people already have conspiracy theories about it, which is a very lazy, preemptive response, because obviously we're not just talking about people who watch Alex Jones every day. We're also just talking about ordinary people, just like centrists who are kind of on the fence, or, for example, even left-wing people who care about data privacy and things like that, who would get extraordinarily pissed off around that. You get all of the normies and you make them more right-wing. Secondly, the reason why this leads to such an extreme reaction is because it's perceived as an infringement on your personal space. That is why the refrain you constantly hear from centrists and normies is, I don't want things getting politicized. I have Twitter so I can see funny memes or whatever. Send like fucking cat photos to my aunt. I'm not on this platform to have propaganda squeezed down my throat. This sense of personal space, of something that is separate from the political world, something that is separate from your everyday world, is something that is extraordinarily important, is something that's extraordinarily valuable to the vast amount of people. Thirdly, this reason why it leads to an extreme reaction is because every piece of progressive content now becomes an affirmation of this, right? Because now, even if you otherwise wouldn't have gotten that progressive content anyway, every single time you see a piece of progressive content, you say, this doesn't deserve to be here. This was just pumped up by the algorithm and did not deserve to be here. You immediately discredit those ideas out of hand. Everything then becomes like a confirmation of this thing that is happening that you think is bad. And fourthly, because there are entrenched norms around fairness. Now you think, because people think, this is really, really unfair. We think this broadly should be a meritocracy. You see the content that you want and is doing well on the algorithm. You don't want things being push down your throat. Before I go on, I'll take CG.
Your own claim is this is an existing narrative. That means you haven't identified the margin whatsoever because people continue to view social media promotion of progressive content as unfair.
Yes, some people are conspiratorial, but the vast majority of people just think of this as normal. And it's not symmetric. If you see on the news, like just imagine this, you see on the news, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are artificially inflating the success of these of particular types of content, are changing the things that you see on your algorithm every single day, are tinkering around with your data. That is a real thing. That is something that people care about. That is something that has happened, right? Which means that the vast majority of ordinary normies who otherwise wouldn't be watching conspiratorial theories now get really, really upset. How does this backlash manifest? Firstly, you simply discredit this progressive content out of hand, even if you otherwise wouldn't have in the comparative. Secondly, it pushes people to the right. Normies now, if it is the case that you assume that progressivism is good, are now more likely to support right-wing candidates because they think that the elite, the establishment, all of these tech companies that govern what they see on a day-to-day basis are taking over their lives or invading their personal space. They are more likely to vote, for example, in swing states for Republicans in the United States. If you think progressivism is good, that is a disaster. Thirdly, people stop using these platforms, which is bad in and of itself because a lot of people just like using Twitter, but also they move on to other sites. For example, whatever the fucking right-wing one is, I don't know the name, but it's like full of incels and shit like that. That's pretty bad. This outweighs efficacy. It's not efficacious on their side for two reasons. Firstly, it is unclear if this can actually switch your allegiances over because there's pre-existing sense of community. You have pre-existing views. There are other posts, for example, as they can see that are going to be on your feed. But secondly, this information pops up and you have a short attention span. You only see it for 2 minutes. The effect is marginal. Unclear why this makes you, Karl Marx or whatever, very proud to oppose.
And I think that's the good for their fine speech and a reminder to speakers that we can't write anything down that happens after 7:15. That being said, I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the proposition sack. Here.
Hello? Can you hear me? Sorry, my internet lagged. Okay. Few eyes in chat, I will take one from closing, and I'll start in just a sec. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. If you really think about it, everybody is impacted by progressivism. Even if you are a toxic male, talking about males' rights right now is something progressive because progressivism deals with every person's human rights to be treated equally before all. Talking about poor people whose jobs are being extracted because corporations just want to pay the least amount of money for their labor is progressive, and it impacts the Middle Eastern random person who lost their job, who voted for Trump because of this. Those goes to show that most people are impacted by this without really realizing. And the fact is that they're so alienated currently because they never interact with this content that they never are able to assess it critically. The only way you're able to solve this is that when you gradually, give them content that is related to them in a way that it impacts their life sufficiently, as Biser already proves, something that is connected to you, something that you already have a fear of happening, is something that is likely to overall convince you, and it's overall likely to shift your behavior in at least small ways that are better than nothing. I will engage with a few things. Firstly, on the principle and the hypocritical analysis that they give. Secondly, on just plain engagement and weighing out the impacts. So I will brief you up. OO says it's morally unjustified for us to brainwash people. I want to ask a very simple question. Why the hell do we allow Murdoch to own every single newspaper in America and to brainwash half of the population in America with right-wing propaganda, and this is seen as justified? Why is it okay for certain politicians to push their agenda and to own social media corporations and to push their party lines, but it's not okay for us to try to protect people's rights? Why is it okay news channels to be directly responsible and to be directly dependent on politicians and who they're appointed to, but it's not okay for social media to do this? I really don't think they prove this. And I want for us to try to protect people's rights. Why is it okay but you have certain beliefs such as you're right wing, so it's unjustified for us to try to coerce you otherwise. One, you never consented into being right wing. Your parents coerced you, your community coerced you, your environment coerced you, but you never consented to be in this environment in the first place. Even if you did in some way. Secondly, the people who are harmed on an everyday basis don't consent to be evicted of their homes, don't consent to have no job, don't consent to not have the right to have a child or to be actively pushed to have this child. Therefore, the way here is maybe both groups are not consenting into something. What we ought to prioritize for us to try to protect people's rights. Right? You maybe do not consent to having certain information in your hand, but you certainly are more harmed when you are not able to feed your family, when you're not able to see your family because you work 24 hours every single week. Therefore, I don't think this is a weighing of, oh, they never consent, but rather, I don't care that they don't consent because the moral harm is quite small. Secondly, though, I want to talk about backlash, the basic argument you run in this debate. Generally, as they just point, they never prove a tipping point. Even if you prove a tipping point, I will gauge at the best. One, this is very short-termistic, to the point of which all themselves characterize the average person who cares about a lot other things. I'm not sure why this person will collectivize in a communistic kind of manner and actively fight against this injustice, right? Try to make this right, vote for other people, and generally be able to make such a big difference. But secondly, I just generally don't think people react in this way because, note, them reacting in a bad way is specifically if they don't relate to the content we give them. This is dependent on them proving that the content you see will make you angry, that it will make you realize that you are in a liberal kind of propaganda world, that you're being brainwashed. But most people won't realize this because people brainlessly watch social media in trying to escape from their everyday struggles. Meaning, when you just watch a certain video of a black woman sharing her experience about being discriminated in the workplace, why will you think this is Western propaganda when you see an individual, not a politician, not some fancy party line, but a rather normal person like you with problems that you just don't understand because you haven't experienced? Comparatively, this is better for us to push than some arbitrary party lines or supporting progressive parties that are also morally corrupt. It's better for us to push stories of people to get more recognition and awareness for problems that impact all people over the long term, such as climate change, such as having no raw materials to live with. Secondly, though, on why our impacts are more important. Let's say some people will get radicalized. Why is this less important? I have three pieces of weighing. One, some people are able to change their opinions in a way that helps others. Why is this the case? One, if you think about it intuitively, you changed or realized something was a problem when another person told you. I realized that changing the euro in Zagreb is bad because the prices went up. You know that Bulgaria is corrupt because you talked to us. Meaning, the change happens on an individual level. Meaning, I hear your story, you hear my story, and you're able to feel empathy towards me. The only way you're able to then achieve this change is when on social media, you're able to see the relatable stories of other people and actively engage within them, because it's not politicized. It's just people talking normally and expressing their problems. Why is it then able to change in some way your voter preferences? One, even if you will say that you will not vote for the president to be liberal, you have other alternatives such as voting in referendums, for example, to gay marriage to not be delegalized, right? Because this doesn't impact you in any way, even if there is a trade-off for you voting for a president that would economically maybe harm you. But secondly, you can vote in local elections in a different way because it's not a single vote issue type of election, but rather a multitude kind of people are elected during that time. Secondly, and before I continue, closing?
Yeah, so people that you are talking about are people who are on center or close to center, which means that they are already symmetrically likely to be able to convince just by getting multitude of different.
But that's not true, because the comparative is that you have right-wing propaganda dominating, and I already explained this because it is the status quo. They own the TV, they own the newspapers, they own most of the media communication within the population. Comparatively, people are easily susceptible. Right-wing people have the ability and the propaganda machines to do so. We are able to counterbalance this on our side. Now, secondly, even if you don't vote, one, you're better able to push your politicians for changes, right? You can fix certain issues, not through definitely right or left-wing kind of ways. Meaning, if you care about climate change, it doesn't have to be a left-wing policy. You can create businesses that are green, or you can subsidize national agencies. There are different ways you can approach this, but the fact that you just know that this issue is happening is important enough to fix it to your paradigm of your opinions of left and right. Secondly, you change your behavior on the ground. You think twice before you're a bigot to other people. You think twice before you're able to discriminate others when it doesn't fucking impact you. This, even if it sounds small, escalates over time. But lastly, people who are minorities feel safer on those platforms. Even if some leave, that they had the privilege to be there in the first place, minorities didn't.
And I thank the speaker for their fine speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for opposition side. Here.
All right, cool. Am I audible? Can you hear me? Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I just think if progressivism were as appealing for every individual as OG tries to portray it, everyone in this world would be progressive. But as a matter of fact, they're not. People have incredibly different values, and they value a lot of different things in life. And many people, a majority of people on Earth right now, would, for instance, say that a perceived sense of liberty and freedom is more important to them than, for instance, getting a lot more taxable income and having like health and public hospitals. It's true that for us debate left-wingers, those seem like trivially like true things, but that's not the case for a majority of the world. So when DPM comes and says you never consented to being right wing, so this is a justification for a total breach of the contract that companies did between you and them, I just don't think that's true. Like, not having consented to becoming right wing or having consented, I don't care. You are right wing. That's not a justification for breaching your consent even further, or breaching this idea of consent, or not even breaching consent, but breaching a contract that you have made on a one-on-one level with the company. It's just like you don't get from X and Y just because, like, you know, the world is like isn't like entirely like there's no free will and stuff like that doesn't mean that you get to push it further and go against this contract that you've had with like the companies. But secondly, the second way I'm going to defend Aidan's principle is just that they don't respond to it. Like, the question was never one of brainwashing. The principle that Aidan presented wasn't brainwashing is bad or propaganda is bad necessarily. The principle was theft is bad. And what happens with this motion isn't the fact that people, you know, get like manipulated en masse, although that's a problem. But the previous problem is the fact that you consented into something with a company, you think that's what you're getting, and secretly or not secretly, those things are being stolen for you. That's the principle. There's no engagement with that principle in the way that Aidan has portrayed it. No, thank you, I'm not taking POI. Firm opening. Why is this then on Backlash? Why is this relevant? And why is this a particular change? Because probably closing is going to run something of this sort as well. Like, there's already a lot of narratives that tell people that, oh, like the left wing's elites are controlling everything. What is the particular type of extra difference that's added? Number one, I think in this case, you actually see an actual change, because notice that the status quo is a status quo in which you have full control, or like kind of control over your newsfeed, right? You like something, more of it appears, right? You have a lot of like visual feedback and a lot of like visual evidence of what you want, and you feel like you have control over it, and you kind of do, because that's how like the algorithms work. Now, not only do you kind of probably know that this has happened, but now you see your feed starting to transform. And the more right-wing on the spectrum you are, the more like enraged you are likely to get at this, right? You don't get that sort of like physical evidence and visual evidence for yourself individually on their side of the house. But secondly, ask yourself, what does a tech company have to do in order to be successful at like doing all of this progressive propaganda? It has to get increasingly better at manipulating the data of each and every individual and of garnering as much information of them for this propaganda to be successful. The more OG goes, oh, this is going to be so good because we're turning everyone into commies, the more they say that this company is going to dig even deeper into the preferences of each of its users. It's going to get even better at cramming each data of every individual, and it's going to get even better at like literally harvesting all there is to know about you, right? This is important, right? Firstly, because it like reinforces all of the theft principles that Aidan talked about, but also secondly, because it means that every act of propaganda they do is going to be even more noticeable for you. They're going to get even better at targeting you with this information. So it's going to be, no, thank you, even more obvious for you that like this is happening. This is again a type of change that you don't have in the status quo. Thirdly, I think people in the status quo, the rational person, not like the Ben Shapiro fan, is like really usually guided by this idea of like innocent until proven guilty. Like that's why conspiracy theories don't usually become mainstream in a lot of issues, in a lot of instances, right? Because until you see the actual fact, until you see all of these things that I talked about and you have the visual evidence for what's happening, you're unlikely to say, oh yeah, we're all being ruled by the left-wing elite. Or even if you say it, you don't actually believe it, right? You know, it's probably kind of just a rhetorical talking point that your favorite talk show hosts do like to talk about. But internally, you're not that scared about it. You know, it's like, you know, like some punchline that they use in order to get a lot of clout for their videos, but you don't deeply believe in it. The moment this becomes a real thing, it's no longer deniable. It's no longer something that could potentially be conspirational. It is something true that you see as a fact. Why is this important? Two reasons, no thank you. Number one, because these are the very people who might have tilted on the other side, on our side of the house, right? Like recognize that like Republicans, like dead ass, like right wingers, no thank you, are not going to be the type of people who are going to be able to change through repetition. Like as many times as you're going to show them like, oh, minorities aren't actually evil, they're still not going to believe in you. But the very people that are on the center, no thank you, the very people that are on the center are the exact people that right now, instead of maybe opening the article because they feel like it's something that just randomly appeared in their feed, are not even going to engage in it because they're going to see the engagement of tapping on that article as an active like forfeit of their own like individuality and personality. Notice how propaganda works and how people generally think about the way propaganda works, right? Like if you think about it, the reason we tend to hate propaganda is because we see it an attack towards our own rationality, our own intellect, our own individuality, right? Oh, you think I'm so stupid that I'm worth being manipulated, right? This is why people hate it. And this proves to you that the very people who you might be willing to tilt on our side of the house, no thank you, the very people who might potentially change because they're not as politicized, they don't think everything left-wing is bad and a ploy against them, are exactly the type of people that you lose on their side of the house. Before going any further, closing if there's any POIs. Opening.
We know that Facebook and Instagram made out in the elections and steal our data every single day, yet we use them every single day for 8 hours because they're more addicted to our monkey brain than backlash to short-termistic.
Yes, I have two responses here. First of all, it's clearly not to the same extent. Like, it's one thing to have some bots that like put some information out there, but you still have kind of a lot of control over your feed. And it's another thing to have like the literal person who created the literal feed that you're on, like distribute this like propaganda. But the second response here is that the comparative is not just like right-wing TV. Like in the status quo, you can still have, like, in what we're still supporting is like maybe a lot of left-wing people like deliberately building like really big like left-wing pages, right? Where they have a really, really big left-wing page where they talk about their left-wing things, right? We're fine with users disseminating a lot of left-wing values. We're fine with users talking a lot about progressivism. What we're not fine and sort of like counteracting those like big right-wing forces. Equally, we're probably fine with like stopping that type of like, you know, like the spies that come from Russia and put bots on the internet. All of those are better solutions than getting the main person that like literally controls the whole social media to deal with that. So essentially, and like to sum this up, because to sum this up, this fundamentally is like a principle that like steals people of their right. It breaches the contract that people create between them and the companies. It is not likely to be effective because the like immediate response you're going to get from people is to disengage from it entirely. It is likely to politicize and anger the very people that might have tilted your way. For all of these reasons, oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their fine speech and call upon the member of government to extend the case to the opposition side. Here.
Awesome. I'll take POIs in chat, please. That would be great. People are very unlikely to boycott mainstream social media companies on our side of the house for at least two reasons. The first is that social media as an industry demonstrates strong network effects and hence tends towards natural monopoly, because you usually go to social media for the friends, connections, and communities you can find there. The problem then with small social media companies is you lack those network economies of scale because there are not as many friends and people to talk with. You cannot have as many meaningful and deep conversations, which is why there are naturally a small number of social media companies which under our side of the house implement this policy, hence rendering the prospect prospect of a mass boycott to smaller platforms unlikely. And even if that boycott occurs, people are likely to naturally gravitate back towards larger companies. The structural reason why is not what Open in Government says, which is social media is addictive, because presumably small corporations also have addictive algorithms and are able to trap you in that way. The better reason is because large companies by nature dominate the industry. In many cases, governments explicitly regulate that only a small number of social media companies are deemed viable. In many other countries, particularly in the developing world, social media companies have a stranglehold over user bases because they are the company which provides access to internet services in the first place, like the laying of internet infrastructure in Burma by Facebook and Meta. But it's also because naturally larger corporations have better services. They often have better server infrastructure, for example. They're able to maintain a larger user base. They're able to provide a greater integration of different platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook and so forth. All of this fills a crucial analytic gap in Open in Government's case. Why, if this policy is as legitimately controversial as Opening Opposition says, will people not leave en masse? This is the reason why boycotts are unlikely, and hence why this policy has the potential for efficacy, which is a needed mechanism for Opening Government's case to work. Two extensions then at closing government. First, why promoting progressive content is not just justified per OG, but an active moral necessity. And secondly, on how we facilitate political de-radicalization and limit the worst harms that come from violence and racism on social media. First extension on the principle. Opening Opposition is right. Social media companies have no legitimate claim to prioritize one ideology over the other. And that is a sufficient response to Opening Government's claim that you couldn't have consented to right-wing values and the right-wing media is dominant in the status quo, given that Opening Opposition legitimately proves that there is a contractual duty for social media companies to be fair and respect ideologies. The thesis then of this argument is quite simple. Historically, and even in the present, despite what crazies on the right like DeSantis will tell you, social media companies legitimately have played a major role in enabling conservative indoctrination in right-wing echo chambers and favoring right-wing perspectives, often at the expense of the left. There are three reasons structurally that's true. The first is that algorithmic systems on social media pigeonhole otherwise center conservative individuals into outright right-wing echo chambers. And the reason why is that algorithms work on a basis of prediction. They assume that the next best thing you want to see is that which you've seen in the past, and hence people, without their consent, gradually become more and more right-wing over time in a way that is manipulative. That flips Opening Opposition's principle by demonstrating that moderate right-wingers are often unfairly echo chambered and pigeonholed into the craziest right-wing views without their consent. This policy is a counterbalancing force against that. Secondly, right-wing media has historically been far more dominant on social media than the left. Why is that? The right wing historically has been far wealthier. It is connected to established and traditional institutions, which often meant it had the money to do things like engage in extensive political advertising on Twitter in the lead up to major elections in many countries, particularly in the developing world. And the right wing on average tends to be more willing to promote the sensationalist content that gets clicks on social media because it is right-wing media like Fox or Breitbart that is willing to eschew the conventional principles of ethical journalism to get clicks. And in an increasing era of global liberalization, the tactics used by right-wing media have become increasingly unfair to get more people to listen to their stories and watch their news media on social media. That's why in many cases, right-wing social media or right-wing media platforms are the most likely to do things like utilize sensationalist clickbait articles that get people to click, even if objectively that's unfair for leftist media that's less willing to do so. And it's also intuitively because historically right-wing media has been highly present on social media companies, platforms. The problem is that right-wing media often then has a chilling effect on minority speech, because when there is a news article that is harshly xenophobic or has Islamophobic undertones or tacitly suggests support for racist values, that often chills minorities out from speaking openly on these platforms because they legitimately fear for their own emotional safety. And the discourse promoted by those sorts of news stories often makes people feel unsafe. The ultimate duty of social media is to promote discourse, to enable conversation, to facilitate social connections. They are the open marketplace of the 21st century. That principal duty is violated when right-wing media dominates on social media. Look, DeSantis would tell you this argument is crazy. In the real world, it's not. We agree with Opening Opposition that social media companies ought not prioritize some sets of ideologies over other. This policy then is corrective for the historical favoritism displayed to the right-wing media, outweighing OG by proving the legitimacy of this policy and beating OO's principle at the same time. This is also independent of efficacy. Even if people do not become progressive, there is still a moral duty to expose people to these ideas. Second extension, promoting progressive content reduces radicalization. Before that, OO.
Everyone recognizes that artificially inflating conservative content is morally bad for the reasons we gave. Surely the alternative is reform, e.g. post-Cambridge Analytica investigations, not do more of the same and double down on the principal harm.
No, our claim is not that social media companies actively promote right-wing media. It's that the nature of right-wing media, the tactics it uses, and the finances it has access to artificially favors right-wing media in social media network feeds. Reform is unlikely. Cambridge Analytica was a data scandal, not really about news media, and presumably is unlikely to work in the vast majority of cases given entrenched status quo bias and the privileged people who run these corporations. Second extension, let's talk about political radicalization. The first tier to this argument is that social media feeds tend towards radicalization. That is intuitively because algorithms reinforce your present political biases and hence make you become more radical over time. This is not about politics, to be clear. This is about moral values, like are you willing to engage in racialized violence against the Rohingya minority in Myanmar, which has historically been demonized by hate speech on Facebook. And news feeds are particularly important because people often see the headline and scroll away and then make broad sweeping conclusions about the world based upon that, which then inform their decisions about whether or not you engage in hate-based politics. And this media often plays into your fear. It taps into sensationalist media incentives to make people scared that the local immigrant community is racist and drug dealers. Content moderation simply cannot work. And the major reason why is that in developing countries, there is simply a socio-cultural and linguistic barrier. There are literally 12 people in the entirety of Meta that are fluent in the major languages spoken in Burma. And hence that is why the content produced in areas like the Tigrayan province of Ethiopia or Burma takes literally weeks to get taken down because there are cultural barriers. And the profit incentive of social media companies incentivizes cutting down content moderation. Our policy is a better substitute for ineffective content moderation because you expose people to alternative ideologies. Unlike OG, we don't require you to become progressive. We just need to shatter the idea that the only legitimate beliefs are those shown to you on extremist right-wing media, which become more intense over time. And under our side, we incentivize the production of that progressive media. This isn't about politics. It's about violence, extremism, and hatred. And hence we propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech and call upon the member of opposition to extend the case to the opposition side. Here.
Am I visible and audible?
Yep.
Amazing. Cool. Just a moment. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Not only DeSantis would say the government case is crazy, I say the same thing. The first thing I'm going to do is to prove why the government bench cannot make the claim that progressivism is a good thing. Opening opposition only says they don't prove that. I'm going to prove the opposite. 2 levels here. Firstly, on utility, which is the metric coming from opening government. Know that utility is a human concept, which is to say outside of human existence, there is no utility insofar as utility is not perceived. This means it doesn't exist outside of perception through the lens of subjectivity. On a new intuition level, I can be very rich and still be unhappy because my definition of utility is different to yours or anyone else in this room. For right-wing people, it's insulting to suggest to abolish the right to life. It is immoral to deny a deserving student the right to access to university based on affirmative action. There is true fear that their children are being driven to doubt their sexual identities in schools. This is a deep-seated feeling of immorality, of fear, and injustice to the same extent to which people on the left perceive utility when it is given to them. This means 2 implications for the government bench. Firstly, they don't increase utility, which is to say, therefore, that they don't fulfill their metric. But secondly, they arbitrarily preference one set of beliefs over another. This is morally unjust without the knowledge based on which you would do that. But secondly, on the level of existence of objective truth, it is unclear whether it exists, and there is no indication that it does. But more importantly, even if it did, it's inherently epistemically inaccessible, because all humans are born into discourse. We are all a priori infected by our linguistic registers, by our cultures, by our moralities, desires, and experiences, which means we cannot even define the metrics of the search for objectivity, because the very word objectivity is an empty signifier. We have different meanings of what it means to be objective. Therefore, if there were such a truth, we cannot find it. This means fundamentally that the government bench is basing the right of social media to arbitrarily preference one set of content on a moral and intuitive hunch. And insofar as they base their case on utility, I don't care that the right-wing media is currently dominating the world and stuff like this. But CG does something a bit more nuanced, right? They say this is reparatory. I have 2 responses here. First of all, one moral evil doesn't justify another moral evil. 2 moral evils can coexist. Something being unjustified so far means we need to support things like antitrust laws, not include another element of arbitrariness that they themselves claim is immoral. So they themselves prove that this type of action is immoral. Secondly, they also concede that the point of social media is about discourse. Insofar as this is literally replacing one type of content with another type of content, they're not engendering discourse, so they're directly not achieving their metric. But thirdly, because I thought of another one, even if there is a reparatory duty, it's unclear why it's fair to externalize that reparatory duty to people who would speak out in a right-wing manner. Why do the previous evils of social media require me, a third party who did not participate in that evil, to waive my right to speak or to persuade others in order for somebody else to rectify their prior evils? This link was not made. What are the moral evils that are being made by the side of government on both sides? Firstly, denial of information. Know that people believe in different political truths and they vote and act to realize a world as close to those political truths. In doing that, information is key. The more arguments, the more statistics, the more views you interact with, the better you're able to cross-reference with your own beliefs and make the vote or political action that's best for you, regardless of ideology. Namely, I can be progressive and stay progressive, but if I hear a conservative criticism of my belief, this might make me reconsider which left-wing party I'm voting for or who I'm voting for in the primaries. But even if people don't even access this information or don't even try to access it, its very existence is an inherent moral good, because it implies the existence of a tool that people may use if they want to achieve the subjective utility that government talks about, even if there is no practical delta. This motion denies them that because it directly removes certain forms of ideas, therefore certain forms of information. But there also is a practical delta, because the current algorithms are not biased in terms of progressivism, which means that they're not that nuanced. If I read mostly liberal media, I'll get more Guardian or BBC than I do Fox News, but I'll still interact with a centrist right column or op-ed on Guardian, which might switch my beliefs. This doesn't happen on the government side, or at least it doesn't happen if they want their case to be effective, because that means a meaningful replacement of right-wing content with left-wing content. Secondly, it implies the denial of right to expression. Know that nobody has full access to the repository of your emotions, thoughts, etc. Therefore, the only thing people interact with is the image you project outwardly. Insofar as I'm now denied as a right-wing person the capacity to speak to others, I am denied the right to project my image, therefore to control my social environment. Secondly, for a lot of people, it is crucial to their identity that they try to persuade others, regardless of whether they're successful. You are denying the capacity of persuasion to these people on a nuanced level. Note my earlier comparison as to why current algorithms don't prevent this to a certain extent. Also, governments talk about, right-wing stuff and how this is not left-wing bias today proves that. But thirdly, insofar as there is no objective truth, persuasion is morally legitimate and therefore should not be denied, and you should not externalize blame in the way the government bench does. Identity only exists insofar as it's affirmed by other individuals. As far as I can communicate and get a response. What social media is doing here, even if the status quo is imperfect, is knowingly denying people a right that they have, or at least denying it to a larger extent than today. So even if the delta is small, it is still a moral evil. The way this weighs up is, first of all, it's true regardless of backlash. Secondly, even if people become more right-wing or don't become more right-wing, we don't care, we prove it's a moral evil. But thirdly, the principle from opening opposition is, people are going to think, this is theft and stuff like this. But the theft argument only works if their practical argument on people knowing this doesn't work. Because if they know, they can just shift to other platforms. So this argument stands regardless. I'll also engage on the practicalities. But before I do that, I'll take opening governments.
On both sides, they're echo chambers, so your comparative isn't multiple nuanced viewpoints for the sake of engagement. It's likely another echo chamber that is just not progressive.
One, I gave you nuance already. Secondly, I've already told you that one moral evil doesn't nullify another, doesn't rectify other moral evils. Now, on efficiency, opening opposition is correct to already point out that there is a margin, Tejas, and the margin is the right wing can now say there is a fucking conspiracy because this is what they've done. But what is the actual comparative? People might stay on Facebook. I'm not saying they're going to stop using Facebook, but because they know that their feeds are being tailored and they believe this happens to a bigger extent than it does, even if it's actually gradual, because they're being primed by people like Trump or DeSantis to believe that, they're going to go deeper into platforms like Deep Reddit, like 4chan, like Trump Social. This is where they become more easily radicalized, which flips the closing government claim, because these are the worst areas where stuff like hate speech is promulgated. On Facebook, if you're a Trump person, you are in an echo chamber and you will interact with Trump articles, but you're less likely to interact with QAnon because there are fact checkers, EU-regulations, civic integrity groups that reduce the reach of that content and remove that content. So the worst excesses, there's a difference between whether you believe Trump should win or whether you should storm the Capitol, whether there is reverse racism or whether this requires vigilante action against black people. The worst excesses of hate speech, the worst excesses of harms to people are removed and exacerbated at the point where you push people on these more radical platforms. But lastly, I just don't think they're efficient. At the point where this is gradual and you only see one article a day or something like this, you're still surrounded by your family, by your religion. Most of your articles are still right-wing. You're going to treat that article as an exception and continue believing in your moral framework. People don't abandon their entire identities just because of one article. They don't have efficiency. For centrists, it's uncomparative because they already have a balanced amount of content anyway. In the status quo, we win this debate as closing opposition.
And I thank the speaker for their fine speech and call upon the government whip to close the case for proposition side. Hear, hear.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
POIs in the chat exclusively, please. Just give me 1 second. Let me turn on the light. I want to start with our extension and how it compares to OG. The first reason we beat OG is because we prove that people who are center-right actually stay in these platforms, which is the contingency for OG to get any of their benefits of people being convinced by progressivism, including moderates. Here's the extent of OG's mechanization on this front. One, they say people won't find out because this narrative exists anyway. But even if they weren't to find out, as opening opposition points out, getting an overload of progressive content on your feed or getting multiple progressive articles might make you want to disengage with social media and, as Tim says, move to Truth Social. Second, OG says they are addictive, but they give you no reason why alternate social media platforms are any less addictive. So at the end of OG, we lack a mechanism for why people stay in these platforms, which is the contingency to their case. Ryan gives you this mechanization that Tin ignores when he makes his final extension that you switch to 4chan and finally interact with QAnon. We give you 3 reasons why you don't. One, strong network effects. Large amounts of people, especially in developing countries, depend on singular social media platforms for interaction because everyone else is on the platform. And there's a collective action problem where if only the right-wing people move to Truth Social, you don't have a platform to interact with a person who gives you milk every day on WhatsApp like you would in India. Therefore, when very large groups don't move together, the first mover that is a social media platform has a massive advantage to begin with. Second, in most countries, this is literally infeasible because big social media companies established an early presence in the internet. They were often the first investors because they got massive user bases that way. So Facebook with internet.org, for example, or Reliance Jio pumping up big social media companies and giving them favorable internet access, given the absence of net neutrality laws in the developing world. Third, there's simply a resource asymmetry that social media companies have massive data centers and know precisely how to hook you because they have more data about you and know how to make you addicted to that specific kind of social media. Truth Social isn't kicking off. Paula literally shut down. This means people actually stay in these platforms, which is the contingency for opening governance case that they did not prove. The second pathway that we give you is about fighting violence and extremism. And this is critical because all of closing opposition's claims about identity exploration depend on you living in the first place. Violence is a fundamental attack on who you are as a person and on your identity. We show that violence reduces in a manner critically that doesn't depend on turning you into a progressive. Because without promoting progressivism, we show you the narratives you get on social media platforms are often primarily violent extremism in developing countries. Why is this the case? The reason why is because extreme rhetoric necessarily gets substantially more engagement to begin with. The reason why is liberals and conservatives might both be stuck in echo chambers, but liberals are far more willing to break out of their echo chambers and engage with conservatives, both because as OG frames, liberals come from a culture of free speech, and because things like call-out culture empirically substantially cascaded onto the liberal atmosphere a lot more, meaning they are willing to engage with right-wing content as well, while right-wingers are often less willing to engage with progressive content. The implication is social media algorithms often implicitly overweight right-wing content that gets a lot more engagement, and center-right people therefore move to substantially more extreme rhetoric. But beyond just right-wing content, it's often the case that people were from majorities with privileged networks doing things like spreading rumors on social media, building up anti-Rohingya Facebook groups get a lot of attention simply because they're often the first people to access the internet and the first people to get to use social media to begin with. Critically, moderation does not solve this. Social media companies have limited moderation capacity, often running sweatshops in countries like Ghana where moderators run their time, especially moderators in a wide spectrum of different languages, and a moderation system that depends on reporting that never happens. This is why Facebook facilitated the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, because extreme rhetoric spreads easily on social media, is much more polarizing, and gets more engagement, necessarily uplifting it. Why do we solve this problem? We are not contingent on convincing people to change their minds. We solve this problem by taking space away from the echo chamber, because the center-right people who are most susceptible to having their minds changed get less exposure to these ideas if we overweight progressive content in their algorithm, because the mechanism through which they are convinced is often repetition. When you have progressive content or the algorithm, you take space away from this extreme content, which reduces violence. Our third pathway is justice. The primary claim, so the thesis of this argument is that right-wing has a rigged system on social media. Now, OG sort of hints at this. They say Murdoch, right-wing has power over the media. But they do not actually explain why the right-wing is wealthier and how they use that on social media. Apart from my claims on sensationalism, the key point is they have more donors because they benefit from the traditionalist setup, which is what conservatism is. Progressivism is about changing the established status quo, and therefore people who are progressive often benefit less from the established status quo. What that means is all their claims about the lack of an objective moral truth are flipped. Ping's response: two wrongs don't make a right. Our point is not that you simply have a reparative obligation. Our point is, if you primarily get exposed to conservative content right now, and you have a bunch of feeders into conservative content, even if we overweight progressive content, you don't lose out on conservative content that just levels the playing field, which is a moral virtue in and of itself, as opposition concedes. Now I want to comprehensively engage op bench and explain why they lose independent of our extension. First, closing opposition. They say the more arguments you interact with, the better you cross-reference beliefs. Problem one, social media is a substantial echo chamber due to the constant recommendation of algorithms that you like. Tin says his case is more nuanced, but he adds no further nuance for why they get cross-reference beliefs. Apparently, there are center-right Guardian articles. I don't know them. I don't know who's engaging with them.
Moving on to Truth Social was only one of our harms. We proved more generally that this will lead to centrists immediately discrediting progressive content because they see it as lies.
I'll respond to that. Let me just finish closing opposition. So closing opposition's other claim is the right to free expression, that people can only access one image. You're not denied a right to free expression because you still, as a right-wing person, have more of a platform. If you're privileged, you can pay for Twitter Blue. You have larger social networks reading your content in the first place. All this does is level the playing field. Okay, opening opposition. Morally equivalent to theft, I think our principle implicitly engages this, leads to substantial backlash among moderates. Look, this is contingent on people finding out. Even if they get more progressive content in their feeds to begin with, that doesn't necessarily mean they find out, insofar as social media companies keep this secret. The reason there's a lack of a margin is because there are strong incentives for any political ideology to pump up the persecution complex of itself. So when someone notices one progressive post on social media, they still think, look, social media is rigged against that, because they notice that much more than the more normalized conservative content that's in our stream. Overall, our case is not dependent on progressivism being good or making people progressive. It's dependent on leveling a rigged playing field and ensuring violent extremism does not win out. Propose.
And I thank the speaker for that very fine speech and call upon the opposition whip to close the debate for opposition bench and indeed the debate as a whole. Here.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll just go team by team, starting with, let's say, closing government. Firstly, they say this is something that is rightfully justified because historically right-wing has been fostered on social media. Firstly, I don't think this responds to Tin's analysis, which is like Tin's extension, which is perfectly interacting with this. One moral evil does not nullify the other. We don't believe that correct response to this, like, how we say, like historical injustice or whatever, is like to create another moral evil. Like, why is it legitimate to do this, even if it does lead to some utilitarian benefits? Why is this legit to do this in a way that you are like how you say, like limiting freedom of speech of people that want to share their, you know, conservative opinions on Twitter and stuff like this? Why is this justified by tampering with these people and stuff like this? Secondly, they're talking, and this is something that's very important because CG is focusing mostly on extremism and people feeling unsafe. We can we can limit this on our side of the house as well. Conservatism is not equivalent to extremism. Saying I support abortion is not equivalent to saying I hate women and stuff like this. These are not two things that are interacting. So hate speech and stuff like this, making people feel unsafe, this is something that already is like under the law banned. Like this is hate speech. There is a difference between freedom of speech and hate speech. Things that you are, things that, I don't know, Ben Shapiro, when he's coming to, when he's saying things that he's allowed to say and that he isn't allowed to say, which means that I do believe that this is outside of debate. But let's engage in this in more nuanced way. What we tell you, and this is how we are also extending over the opening opposition, because what we are telling you is that what you're going to get is retaliatory mechanism of people going to the places that are much more shielded, such as 4chan, deep edits of Reddit, and all these sorts of things. And the reason how we extend over the opening opposition is they just say, there's going to be backlash because people are going to believe in conspiracy. And this is not responsive to Tejas POI, but the reason why you're going to believe in conspiracy is there's obviously a different from the status quo, because in the status quo, when some crazy people start talking about conspiracy, the social media can be like, look, guys, this is exactly how our algorithms work and stuff like this. But this is not something that can happen on their side of the house. I also want to say, secondly, they say, Tejas says, Paula is dead and stuff like this. Yes, because right now platforms are allowing conservative discourse on the social media. This would not have happened if, they would be completely excluded from the conversation and all these sorts of things. But they're also not getting any kind of change. And this is how I'm going to engage with opening government as well. Because Maria, I will take you at 5, so not now. This is how they are getting, they're not getting change on their side of the house. Why is this so? Firstly, on efficacy, they say this is going to be done in a gradual way. If I'm conservative and I get 9 liberal articles, but I get 1 conservative article, I want to conform my beliefs because I want to feel good about myself. I want to believe that I'm a good person, so I'm going to ignore 9 liberal articles and I'm going to interact with the conservative article because I want to get a confirmation for my beliefs. I don't want to think about, I don't know how my opinions are bad and stuff like this, which means that if this is done in a gradual way, which is OG setup, they are not getting a meaningful delta. Secondly, they say social media is the tipping point. Very often it's not. Like, even if I get exposure to liberal ideas on social media, then if I'm like gym bro, I go to gym with my other gym bros and we talk about how much we hate women. Then I go to my work and I talk with my colleagues how much I hate poor people and stuff like this. I go to church and I hear church propaganda from my priest and I'm like, okay, it's fine. Like, this is not, and then, reading TikToks and all these sorts of things is not going to tilt me away from my already existing beliefs. But third reason why this is not working in the efficacy is because people know things. So this is attacking their mechanism. They say, people just don't know stuff. People very often know stuff. They just have personal reasons why they're affiliated with certain ideology more than the other. And this is because, rich people know they are exploiting poor people. Like, they know this, but they are not going to change this because some girl made a TikTok about it. They just want more money. And this is why, white girls on TikTok are not going to change anyone's mind and stuff like this. Now they say, there is right-wing propaganda today circling that and stuff like this. So I noticed that you nodded your head when they say this, but this was assertion. This was just asserted. I would like to posit that Guardian, Economist, BBC, CNN, strongest media houses today have the most followers, have the most subscribers, all these sorts of things, more than like Daily Wire or PragerU or whatever the fuck. So this is not something that is inherently true. But secondly, even if it is inherently true that there is right-wing propaganda, this is limiting their impact, because if right-wing propaganda is everywhere, then on the, TikTok and social media and stuff like this is not going to have huge effect on my opinion and stuff like this. But secondly, they say there are some people who are like close to center who are able to tilt their opinions. 2 responses to this. And one is a strategic observation, because notice their impacts. Their impacts are, we have to have change. We have to have people who are going to vote for progressive policies and all these sorts of things. If they want to claim those impacts, they need masses of people to be able to change politics and all these sorts of things. They need people in power to change their opinions and stuff like this. At best, they are proving that
some people who are moderate are going to read one article and be sad and going to change their opinions. This is at best interpretation of the opening government, which is not enough for them to be able to claim all their impacts about social change, poor people not getting exploited and all these things. OG.
This motion applies to all social medias, meaning Opbench can't prove you go to some smaller corporation social media because all of them have to do this, and CG don't prove an analysis because
you go to Andrew Tate comment section and you jerk off with your gym bros and stuff like this. You go to the gym and you jerk off each other and all these sorts of things. I don't know. Okay, whatever. So you don't really achieve any kind of change in your side of the house. But lastly, and what completely destroys them is thin extension. Even if government bench proves everything, this is moral evil. This is something that is purely illegitimate for people to shape discourse in such way. They're only, preemption to our, principle is that, but there is already right-wing propaganda, which they do not prove. And even if there is some kind of right-wing propaganda, this is not something that, is comparative. But also they say echo chambers exist and all these sorts of things. If they are so powerful, that they are not getting change on their side of the house. And the reason why we weigh over the opening opposition is notice that their practical impacts are fairly symmetric. No one cares about data harvesting. Right-wing backers, the way that they explain it is fairly symmetrical. The principle that Tim talks about is universal, and you should vote for us.
Thank the speaker for that very fine speech and everyone for what was a fabulous debate. I invite you to virtually cross the floor and shake hands and then leave, and we'll call you back in 15 minutes or so with a call and justification.
Thanks for that.